and the future of course of warfare. And our guest tonight has spent years worrying over that question, thinking about it, and writing about it. He's the author of 4 books with respect to the history of military warfare and the future of military of the military. Dr. Robert Scales, retired Major General, is a graduate of the United States Military Academy. He has a PhD from Duke University. He served in the military for over 30 years. He commanded 2 units in Vietnam, received the Silver Star, served in staff and command positions in the United States and in Germany and Korea, and retired, as I said, as a Major General and as Commandant of the Army War College. A wonderful position. And then in entering civilian life, was president and CEO of Walden University, which entered into the Sylvan Empire, and he is now a senior vice president of Sylvan, whose building you can probably see from where you're sitting, and we're delighted to have him so close by. The 4 books which deal with the question before us tonight, and certainly all of us have been focused upon this extraordinary event which we've witnessed, and the consequences of it, and all the implications and ramifications are still out there before us. But one thing we have witnessed is a rather spectacular military display. And we're reminded of the magnificence of the American military instrument. And we certainly hope that statesmen's wisdom and restraint will guide us in the use of that extraordinary instrument. But in any case, it is a marvelous thing to behold. It's an interesting thing to think about, and the General is one of the great experts in the United States with respect to it. 2 of his 4 books were on military history. He's written of the official Army history, the official history of the Army in the Gulf War, and he's written on firepower in limited war, a history of the doctrines of firepower since the Korean War. He's written a 3rd book on the future of warfare, which is kind of a strategic analogy of the wars that the United States might face in the future. And most recently, he has written on the future of land warfare for the American military. So for this topic, which interests us so much at this present time, we're very, very fortunate to have truly a distinguished authority on the subject matter, and it's my great pleasure to present to you Dr. General Robert Scales.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burr. That's a wonderful introduction. Actually, the reason I got involved in this whole thing of being what the Vice President called retired generals embedded in TV studios was to hawk my latest book, which is called Yellow Smoke. They've got 1 left in Barnes & Noble. And the reason I did that was because all of my books that I've written up until now as a military guy, of course, we couldn't get any money at all since it went into the public coffers. And now when I retired, I suddenly realized that I get paid for this. And since I have a daughter getting married in November, I just want to tell you that please, if you get it, the title is called Yellow Smoke, and it's the future of land warfare for America's military. And a lot of people ask me, how did you get the title Yellow Smoke? And if I could just digress for a moment, I'll tell you. When I was a battery commander in Vietnam during the so-called Battle of Dong Ap Bia, or Hamburger Hill, if you saw the movie, and during that battle, the North Vietnamese would only use yellow smoke for marking. So it got to be, I mean, even the dumbest soldier would think, well, I think the last smoke that I want to use is yellow, because our instructions were if you saw yellow smoke, you shot at it. So on my fire base, over a period of many months of fighting this battle, the boxes of yellow smoke grenades would come in, and they'd always leave the yellow behind. Not stupid, and so we had this huge pile of yellow smoke grenades after a few months. And so it got to be a tradition in my brigade that if you happened to be fortunate enough to leave Vietnam and go home in the vertical position, you would throw symbolically out of the helicopter, you'd throw this yellow smoke grenade, sort of, signifying the fact that you'd survived this horrible ordeal. Well, I said goodbye to my battery at Firebase Bayonet in, it would have been October of 1969, and I had the incredibly bad judgment to hitch a ride home with my battalion commander, who I won't mention the gentleman's name, but he'd just come from the Pentagon. And he got off his helicopter. We'd been on this fire base for about 14 days, and it had rained 54 inches in 14 days. The place was just covered with mud. And I don't know, God only knows what I look like, probably like a terrorist, and covered with mud, unshaven, red-eyed, and he got off in his beautifully starched fatigues and his shine boots and his beautiful, immaculately spit-shined helicopter. And I said goodbye to my soldiers, and I climbed in the helicopter, and this guy really didn't know what to make of me. And he sat at the console seat, and I sat across from him, and he was just looking at me, and then I started rummaging through my rucksack, and I pulled out this grenade. Well, he jumped on me, and he threw me to the ground, and he wrestled the grenade out of my hand, and he said, "What in the hell are you doing?" And I said, well, of course, by the time I explained it, I was gone, out of sight. And to this day, I wondered what those 100 or so of my soldiers thought about the old man not throwing out the yellow smoke grenade, hence the term and the name of the book. What I want to talk to you about today is what is essentially contained in my book, and that's a dissertation on the future of warfare. And it's particularly propitious to do it now because of what's just happened. And what I'd like to do is talk to you through my thesis, and then reserve some time at the end to discuss the Iraqi campaign. But I think as I go through this, understand how this book was published in January before the war came out. Most of it I wrote in the late 90s, and it's sort of a condensation of a series of articles and speeches that I've been giving over the years about the future of warfare. It's a synthesis of those. And so what I'd like to do is spin you through my thesis for about 30 minutes and then open it up to any questions that you might have. Let me begin by saying that throughout history, by the way, I'm a historian, you're locked in the room, you can't leave, you got to hear some history. I'm sorry, but that's the way it goes. Throughout the history of warfare, great powers develop a style of war that's unique to their particular circumstances, driven by technology, geopolitics, and internal politics. Great powers eventually have formations and methods of war that are unique to that particular society, and you're very familiar with them. I mean, to the Greeks of Alexander, it was the phalanx, that rock-solid body of infantry that closed with the enemy with long spears, and the operational arm was the companion cavalry that was the encircling force. To the Romans, since the Greeks fought principally for the control of crops, mainly wheat, the Romans fought for control of an empire, and therefore they developed a formation, the legion, which is far more flexible, far more open, and better capable of operating across a whole spectrum of different types of terrain and against different enemies. France, the first army to really develop the concept of the levée en masse, had to find the structures to be able to grow armies from the traditional army of 40,000 in the field to 1.5 million. And so it was Napoleon that developed the corps, the division, the brigade, and the ability to sort of coalesce the spirit of a nation on the battlefield. Britain, their challenge in the 19th century as a great power was to rule an empire with a very, very small, thin red line. And to do that, they developed, of course, the Cardwell system, the rotational system, the use of regiments of indigenous and of indigenous forces to control what essentially at one time was 3/4 of the land surface of the earth. Germany in the late 19th century, their problem was to fight on two fronts. And in order to do that, they managed to gain the advantage of the internal combustion engine and the radio, and to develop blitzkrieg, or the use of mechanized operational maneuver that, at least early in World War II, stood them in good stead. So after a century and a half of copying the European method of war, America began, I would maintain, after World War II, to develop its own style of war that is uniquely suited to our particular nation and how we've gone about since then of fighting what I call in the book limited liability wars. And it occurred subliminally in a backdrop, if you will, in the shadow of the Cold War, where the American military spent 40 years facing down the Russians in attempting to use a style of war that essentially aped those of the Europeans, and yet at the same time fought a series of limited wars, beginning in Korea through Vietnam and all the other wars you're familiar with. And it was during that time, actually on the battlefield, that the American military evolved a style of war that was uniquely their own. The style of war generally is predicated on the premise that the United States will substitute firepower for manpower, that our center of gravity, unlike other armies that we fought in the past, is dead Americans. Our purpose is to fight and win with minimum cost to human life. And in order to do that, we have developed, refined, if you will, over the last half century or so, a method of warfare that optimizes the use of firepower and killing power, explosive power, delivered increasingly from the air, such that the American style of war has become very air-centric, not only for the delivery of killing power, but for surveillance, for reconnaissance, for the transport of soldiers across the battlefield. And I would maintain that this recent campaign is nothing more than a data point across that continuum of change that further identifies and continues to refine the American style of war. It's very interesting that this came about almost by accident. For those of you who are old enough to remember the Korean War, recall that in 1950, we went to war with Walden Walker as a commander in that theater in an attempt to replicate, metaphorically speaking, the type of warfare that he had fought in the plains of Northern Europe. And the apportionment of firepower to maneuver in that war was about 2 to 1, 2 artillery battalions for every maneuver battalion, a very, very sparse apportionment of air power. Most of the air power went north of the Yalu. That was the way the war was fought beginning in June 1950. By April 1951, all that had changed dramatically. In the spring of 1951, the famous 10th Corps attack north of the Yalu, we went from apportionments of 2 battalions of artillery to a battalion of infantry upwards to 14 or 15 battalions. This famous Van Fleet load, ships and ships of artillery would be drug across the Pacific to be handed out to American soldiers. 10th Corps alone, in one battle, fired 300,000 rounds of artillery in 5 days. Pork Chop Hill, 37,000 rounds of artillery in one 24-hour period. The famous Battle of Bunker Hill in April 1951, 38th Infantry fired 2,000 rounds of artillery in a 1,000-meter square in 8 minutes. In other words, the whole idea of substituting firepower for manpower began to take hold. And why was that? Well, it was because the American leadership got the hint that we were no longer fighting wars, we were no longer engaged in total wars, where we had a blank check for the expenditure of American lives to achieve our political objectives. In fact, when you fight a limited war for limited ends, then the American people issue the American military a very limited means to achieve those ends, the most limited of which, of course, as you know, is the expenditure of human life. And it's interesting also to note as a sidebar that our enemies understand that as well. What was Saddam Hussein's mission in 1991 and recently, just a few months ago? It was to kill Americans. I mean, he had no other strategic objective in mind other than that. So while we, as a society, seek to reduce the cost of combat, our enemies are continually finding ways to make that, to make the cost and blood of fighting campaigns all the more dear. A problem, though, with the Korean War was that it lasted too long. In the summer of 1951, Lin Piao, at the time commanding the armies, actually had a seminar in Beijing where they figured out we're doing something wrong here. And the Chinese changed the way that they were confronting us. Instead of attacking in masses with these long lines of communication from the Yalu, the Chinese changed the way they were doing it and began to disperse, to dig in, to deceive, to find ways to reduce the killing power of American firepower. And so what happened was that by about 1952, when we reached the stalemate period of that war, the lethality curve began to level off while the firepower curve began to increase asymptotically. So you got to a point where the firepower tail was wagging the maneuver dog. Fast forward to Vietnam. Same rule applies. Many of you recall early in the war, Operation Junction City, all those other types of operations back in the search and destroy era in Vietnam. It was, again, sparse. Any of you see the movie We Were Soldiers Once in the Yard? We Were Soldiers. Give you a good sense of what all that was about early in the war. Fairly accurate depiction of how that was done. Sparse applications of killing power for dense aggregations of maneuver, and the casualties, of course, went off the charts. Enter a man called William Depew, training and doctrine command commander somewhat later, but a gentleman who had commanded the 90th Division in World War II. Bill Depew, in World War II, commanded the division that was the greatest killer on the battlefield in Normandy. Unfortunately, it was the Americans that did the dying and the Germans that did the killing. And Bill Depew learned that, and so when he took over the 1st Division in Vietnam, he saw many of the same habits beginning to emerge. And he asked a very simple question. Why am I using battalions of my soldiers to find squads of infantry? Why don't I use squads of my soldiers to find battalions of infantry and kill him with firepower? And so Bill Depew started a process of change in the American military where the close combat forces, just as you saw in Iraq a few weeks ago, increasingly became less and less maneuver forces and more the eyes and the ears, the finding and fixing forces, such that air power could do the killing. But then again, what happened in Vietnam was the same problem that happened in Korea. The war lasted too long. And eventually, the North Vietnamese got it. They learned to disperse. They moved their forces outside the range of artillery fire. They moved the logistics facilities into Laos and into Cambodia. And the firepower attrition curves began to diverge. And by late 1969, 1970, then the whole process became so corrupted that the firepower tail, again, was wagging the maneuver dog. The result was stalemate, and you know the rest of that story. So essentially what happened was that the American military in these two seminal wars had reached a point of stasis where the ability of the American military to find, fix, and kill the enemy was overcome by the enemy's ability to disperse, to go to ground, to deceive, and to lessen the effects of firepower. And this probably would have continued on and on had it not been for technology. 1971, the destruction of the Mujia bridges sent a signal to the rest of the world that the American military had found a possible solution out of the problem, and that was the introduction of precision weapons delivered, again, principally from the air. So perhaps the American military had an opportunity, if it applied itself technologically properly and changed its method of fighting over the years ahead, that it would have a way out of this very, very bloody dilemma. And so was born out of this the new American doctrine of war, born on the premise that technology could kill the enemy forces faster than the enemy could find the means to offset the technological advantage. What it means in terms of the concept is that America fights short wars very well and long wars very badly. That the enemy of the American military is not the enemy so much, but it's time. Time is our enemy's friend, time is our enemy. That we must win very quickly, we must win at low cost, and we must achieve our political ends before the cost of war gets too high. For those of you who are Civil War buffs, you're familiar with Lincoln's term, the arithmetic. And that's what the Americans fight against, is that no matter how long the war lasts, ultimately, no matter how effective the enemy is, the problem is always centered around the attrition that comes with the active phase of combat. So, this means that as we face into the future, we're looking at a new era of limited wars where limited ends demand the expenditure of limited means. We will fight two types of wars, wars of attrition and wars of preemption. Preemption meaning the ability to intercede in the enemy's territory and take him down very quickly before he has the ability to learn how to overcome the advantages that we have in firepower. An adaptive enemy seeks to win not by defeating America in the field, but by avoiding loss. Saddam Hussein's mission was not to beat the United States, but to avoid losing. We had to win in order to win. So given time, an enemy will go to ground. He will disperse, he will deceive, he will slow the pace of battle, he will create friction in an attempt to make the war last too long. So, what's this new American style of war look like? If you just think back to the TV images you've seen over the last few weeks in your mind's eye, let me go down a list and you see if we can tick off the characteristics that you may have seen. A firepower-centered war delivered principally from the air. A knowledge-based campaign where information and knowledge, or wisdom some would say, allows us to sense, see, track, and kill the enemy with great precision. A tactic that emphasized an old Civil War stratagem called the operational offensive and the tactical defensive, where you use the great speed, the great velocity advantage that American forces have to get between the enemy and his center of gravity, which in this last war was what? Baghdad. To get between the enemy and his center of gravity before he has the ability to collapse his forces in, set up an urban defense, and win through the process of attrition. An operational plan that focuses on not only the Air Force emphasis on control of the air, but the exploitation of the air by Army forces as well. And a type of warfare that's entirely different in terms of the linearity or the geometry of the battlefield. It's a battlefield that focuses on capturing and controlling areas rather than striking at central points. As the enemy disperses and goes to ground, then the object of the maneuver force is to do the same. So as you saw in this last war, you saw, instead of attacking principal points, you saw the military attacking areas and trying to control areas with the thought that if you control the enemy's territory, then the time advantage, the clock then shifts from him to us. Because without controlling territory, you don't control the clock. If you don't control the clock, then you can't meter and control the pace of the operation. How do you control the time? Well, you do it by doing several things. First of all, you must have the ability to build a force that has enormous speed. Speed at the strategic level, to arrive in the theater of war very quickly before the enemy can set. Speed at the operational level, just as you saw in this recent campaign, that allows maneuver forces to strike very quickly to get between the enemy and his center of gravity. The 3rd Infantry Division moved something on the order of 360 miles as the crow flies in less than 12 days. And that included a 4-day halt in place during a very violent sandstorm at the end of the first week of the war. Unprecedented, but necessary, because if America is going to win these wars, it must have the ability to achieve great velocity. The second, as I mentioned to you, is knowledge, the ability to see the battlefield with unprecedented clarity and then to understand what it is that you see. The problem that we have as a nation is we have a great ability to count tanks from the air. What we don't have ability to do very well, as we saw in this last war at times, is to determine intent and will and the condition of the enemy. And I think what we're seeing in this last war is an increasing refinement in our ability to do that. It's a difference between data and information and knowledge and wisdom. Each of those 3 phases of knowing passes through a different level of consciousness. And I think what we saw in this last campaign is we're somewhere between knowledge and wisdom. And finally, precision. The ability to strike the enemy with great precision. 1-meter accuracy. You've all seen the smart bombs crashing into different things. But that's not what made this campaign important and different than the first Gulf War. What made it different was it's not just the ability to strike with great precision, but it's the ability to strike the right thing with great precision and to strike it with great precision before it moves. So there are 3 elements to precision. The ability to hit with 1-meter accuracy, got that, done that. That's been around for 30 years. The ability to locate the target with great precision, 1-meter accuracy, and with great discrimination. In the 1999 war against the Serbs, we hit the Chinese embassy with great precision. The problem was it was the wrong target. So this whole point about discretion is important. And the third is an issue called dwell time. It doesn't do any good to strike a target with great precision if the time that it takes to deliver the munition is 30 minutes and the enemy moves in 15 minutes. Then all you do is just hit empty desert. And what's been perfected recently in this war is not the great precision of the weapons. They're no more precise now than they were in 1991. What makes the difference is the other 2 key elements, the speed with which it's delivered and the precision with which the target is located and identified and confirmed is what has made the difference in this campaign. So, what are the characteristics of this new style of war? And since I'm running out of time, let me spin to the last. By the way, what does this lead us to? It leads us to a condition of war where an intervening force like the United States seeks to do one of two things. If the enemy disperses, what the military seeks to do, as you just saw a few weeks ago, is to exploit the paralytic effect of precision fires so that the enemy then goes to ground, much as he did around Baghdad. And then you take a maneuver force and you disperse it throughout, amongst, and between the enemy force to cut the synapses and neurons, to isolate the enemy, to create that sense of fear and the sense of solitude that makes an army fall apart from the inside out, which is exactly what the Iraqis do. And you give the enemy two unacceptable alternatives. One is to mass and risk the destruction by overwhelming air power, which the enemy sought or chose not to do, or the other is to remain dispersed in the hope that you can achieve enough friction and enough damage against the Americans that they'll tire of it and go home. Unfortunately for the enemy, that didn't happen simply because of our ability to destroy the enemy in detail by occupying his territory and taking him down. Now, I've left you with a note of optimism. Let me end this, though, with a note of pessimism. You know, after the last Gulf War, in fact, in 1993, many of you may remember, you ever see the movie Black Hawk Down? Any of you see that? And that was one of Uday Hussein's favorite movies. He had copies of it made and shipped, I'm sure he didn't pay the licensing fee, and shipped off to all of his friends in the Republican Guard. Because he saw that movie and he said, now I understand what America's weaknesses are. And that is they have great technology and the ability to do knowledge, precision, and speed, but they're afraid of casualties, and that's their center of gravity, that's their weakness, and we will exploit it by mimicking what the technicals did against the Rangers in Mogadishu in October 1993. You know, there's a great quote. 1964, a woman journalist was interviewing Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and she said, "How in the world can your little country of 19 million people ever hope to defeat in combat the world's greatest superpower?" And Ho Chi Minh said something prophetic. He said, "They will kill many of us, we will kill a few of them, and they will tire of it first." And so that's the caution I leave you with. After the Battle of Mogadishu, Uday Hussein was convinced that he had the ticket to beating us, which was to leave his armored forces in the field and break his army up into these ever smaller increments and fight Americans with the purpose of just killing Americans. Not killing tankers or infantrymen or pilots, but killing supply clerks, whatever it takes to make us tire of it first. And I was in China in 1998, and I was talking to my counterpart, a gentleman by the name of General Lee Jae-jun, a wonderful gentleman, a Korean War veteran. And he said, well, you know, as you Americans get better and better at your ability to find, to seek, to track, and to kill with ever greater discrimination and granularity, we, on the other hand, speaking of the Chinese army, will increase our ability to disperse, to hide, to go to ground, and to avoid the killing power of American firepower. And just as technology favors you, in many ways, he said technology favors us as well, because Mao Zedong's problem was always dispersing a force and then being able to build it cohesively in mass on demand, much as the problem, of course, they had in Korea in 1952-53. But given the internet, given a modern cellular technology, we in China believe that we will be able to make ourselves ever smaller targets in the future, which will become extremely difficult for you to strike and kill, and ultimately we will prevail. Because remember, General, he said, to beat you, we don't have to beat you. We only need to survive your aerial onslaught and maintain our army in being, and then the problem becomes too difficult for you, just as it was in China and Vietnam. So there you have it. That's the thesis, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have about what I've just laid on you or anything about the recent war in Iraq. Any questions? Yes, sir. The first question was the issue about north of the Yalu. What I meant was the strategic bombing campaign north of the Yalu by the Air Force, which was an attempt to stop the infiltration north of the Yalu. What happened by the spring of 1951 was, rightfully, the Air Force realized that's not where the problem is. The problem is from the Yalu down to the demilitarized zone, and they changed the strategic air campaign into a operational tactical air campaign and became very, very effective towards the end of the war, using B-29s basically as interdicting forces. Your other point is dead on. What does the rest of the world think about this? And that's what keeps me awake at night. After I wrote my book on the first Gulf War in '93, I took a grand tour. I had more frequent flyer miles than the Pope. I had so much fun. I went all over Asia, and what I did is I went to each of our prospective enemies to ask them what they thought about the Gulf War. And to your point exactly. And they had an interesting set of perceptions. The first perception was that we were much better than we really were, which I think we'll see again here pretty soon. I mean, we made some pretty bad mistakes in this war. But to observers in India and Pakistan and the Middle East and China and in Russia and other places that I visit, they were very, very impressed. In fact, almost overwhelmed with the technological superiority of the military. They also drew the conclusion about our vulnerability to casualties. And so they sought, they have been seeking ever since to find ways to, as I said, kill Americans. But one Indian officer said something very prophetic, and it goes to your point about unintended consequences. He said, okay, I got it. The only way we can prevent the United States from intervening in our area of the world is to develop nuclear weapons. Isn't that interesting? So the Pakistani, Indian, and North Korean, I mean, fill in the blanks, Iranian and Iraqi efforts to build nuclear weapons and to develop fissile material or to refine fissile materials in many ways came out of the demonstration of overwhelming conventional firepower that these nations recognized or surmised that they couldn't match, and so the only alternative then was to develop nuclear weapons. So as an unintended consequences of what we've just demonstrated, perhaps, I mean, I don't know for sure, but perhaps the rest of the world may think, okay, I got it. I know how to do this. And it's not what we would expect or hope. Interesting question. In other words, to sort of use American military force for their own regional ends, if we can demonstrate not only our ability, but our proclivity to use the force, which is really the issue, the willingness to use the force. Boy, that's a great question. I'll say this. This is a question to be answered by people who are more attuned to the political diplomatic side of the question as to the military side. But I will say this. I think you know, there's an old saying in the military, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing in this case is always to keep America's best interests in mind. In other words, we must ultimately ask whether it's resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict or whether it's intercession in different periods, like at places like in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, perhaps even in Central Europe, along the periphery of the world island, which seems to be where we tend to be fighting most of our wars. We ultimately have to ask what's in our best interest and to avoid, perhaps as much as we can, being drawn into regional engagements that don't necessarily play to the needs of the nation. You know, there's a great, you know who Paul Kennedy is, wrote a great book about the decline of empires. And one of his themes is that great powers, like the United States or Britain, France, Rome, and even the armies of Alexander, eventually decay in part because they overreach. They tend to be more expansive and they don't know when to contract. And they don't know when to back off. And maybe this is a very subtle hint about that. Great question. Yeah, and I was talking about that earlier. Exactly. It's this idea of an asymmetric reaction to the demonstration of overwhelming force, and there are many ways you can manifest it. Part of it is for state or state-like actors to do as I've just described to you. The other is for non-state actors like Bin Laden or the PLO to do what they do. Let me offer, this is the Bob Scales opinion, and it's probably worth about that much. As a rule, if you're going to threaten America's vital national interest through the use of terrorism, the only way that I believe that you can do that is to have endorsement or support from state or state-like actors. We always talk about this amorphous, internet-driven Al-Qaeda that somehow forms this mystical cloud of threats across the globe. I just don't buy that. I think it's a bunch of crap. I think the truth is that you'll never be able to generate the power necessary to threaten the United States unless you have the support, tacit or otherwise, of a state or state-like actor. That's the problem that Israel has, because of Syria, and used to be Iraq, and to some extent Egypt and others, and Jordan in the areas, are the state-like incubators of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and some of these other types of organizations. Were it not for state support in the Bekaa Valley and in Lebanon, Israel would be able to deal with these powers. It's just the idea that you have this continuous regeneration of the terrorist threat that comes back time after time that makes this thing such an intractable problem. I agree with you, and then again I have to say that to some degree I disagree with you. The question was, I'm not sure what, I'll skip the preamble, but I think the question dealt with that, would the American people become victims eventually to this new style of blitzkrieg? It seems to me that one of the lessons that we learned from Vietnam, at least those of us in my profession, was that the American military will never, to my mind, be sent into harm's way without the approval, or at least the consensus of the American people. Part of that has to do with something that Creighton Abrams back in the 1970s called buy-in. Remember now, the war in Vietnam was fought only by professionals and drafted soldiers. It was essentially the nation in arms giving up its young men and women to go into a war that was insanely unpopular. What you see now is a completely different approach to going to war, where in order to go to war, the American military has to mobilize the reserves and has to strike and has to draw strength from hometown America. This is not like the Roman legion in the sense that this is a Praetorian Guard that marches off to, to bash the Gauls or the Parthians at time and again. It requires the consensus, or at least the buy-in of the American people in order to do this. And if I may have my facts wrong, but the last poll I saw was about an 81 or 82% approval rate of the American actions in this war, taken, in a random sample, a scientific sample of the American people. Now, does that mean there are one or two answers there? Number one is the American people saw the need or the necessity for this war, however tragic it might have been, or somehow we've managed to dupe the American people, and you can fill in the blanks as you will. I will say this, though. It seems to me that what makes this war different than the first Gulf War, or different than Panama, or Grenada, or Haiti, or Bosnia, or Kosovo, or Albania, or all the other wars that we fought, the big difference to my mind, and the thing that argues against your thesis, I think, is 9/11. I think the American people, after 9/11, had a far greater sense of insecurity about being attacked by terrorists than they did about being threatened by the professional military. And therefore, what we saw here, whether there is a direct relationship between Al-Qaeda and Iraq or not, which is debatable, of course, there was a sense of catharsis and there was a sense of closure that came after this war among many of the people who otherwise would have been opposed to the war. There's an old story about the 30-40-30 thesis. You ever heard that about the American people? American people are by nature passive-aggressive. I mean, up until Pearl Harbor, the American First Movement owned about 40% of the American people. After Pearl Harbor, it went to about 90-10. And throughout all of these wars, there's been about a 40-40-30 split among support for military action. 30% are in favor, 30% are rabidly against, and about 40% are stuck in the middle. And opinions tend to shift back and forth based on many different factors, military success and the relevancy of the war being two of the most important. And I think what we've seen recently is an unprecedented figure of something like 81 or 82%, which I think is due in many ways to the nastiness of this regime, and secondly, to the fear that all of you have about what happened, about your own personal security that came about after 9/11. Is it important that we haven't found weapons of mass destruction? And how important is that to, I presume, not only, I say it's not so much important to justifying the war to our own people, but I do think it'll have an enormous importance of making people, particularly in the region, the Middle East, accept what the American military did in Iraq, and that is the presence of weapons of mass destruction. And I don't want to get anything classified here, but suffice it to say, look, let's parse WMD for a second. You know, we talk about WMD being three things: chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Really, there's only two WMD. There's chemical and biological, which are, from a military perspective, have little or no impact on the effectiveness of a campaign. And really, when you get down to it, are so difficult to use against a large urban population. They are, while terrible in theory, are not all that terribly destructive to the society in general. They're just so difficult to deploy. And I can talk about the details of that if you like. The real weapon of mass destruction, ladies and gentlemen, is nuclear weapons. That is the mother lode. And whether or not we find tubs of sarin or VX or mustard gas or even biological agents scattered about the country, which I think we'll eventually find, even though Saddam went on a last-minute campaign to rid himself of those prior to the war. The real issue, to my mind, is one of three questions. Number one is, do you believe that if Osama bin Laden had had a nuclear weapon on the 10th of September, 1991, in New York, that he would have detonated it? Yes or no? I believe he would have. Do you believe that if Saddam Hussein, if the sanctions had been lifted against Iraq, and Saddam Hussein would have been left to his own devices, as he had been prior to 1991, do you believe that Saddam Hussein would have continued and used his oil money to refine uranium into fissile material? Yes or no? I believe he would have. So the question then becomes, do you trust the Iraqi regime, or for that matter, the North Korean regime, on their own to refrain from selling, giving, bartering fissile material or nuclear weapons to Al-Qaeda or to other similar millennialist style of terrorist organizations? I would say probably the odds are low. But I'm not sure I'm willing to risk 13 kilotons going off at the intersection of Broadway and 34th Street as a consequence of what may or may not happen. So there's a difference in the WMD arena, and you have to parse the two. What I'm interested in knowing is how far along did Saddam Hussein come in separating uranium or plutonium from uranium, and how close had he come to weaponizing that? And I think there's no question in my mind that he had an active program and he was trying desperately to do it. And there's some question as to whether or not other nations of the world are trying to do the same thing. So I don't want to leave you with a very pessimistic view of the future, but back to the main thing again, the main thing, ladies and gentlemen, to my mind, as we look decades into the future, worry about our children and our grandchildren, the thing I worry about most is the fear of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I am firmly convinced. Look, if Al-Qaeda has a nuclear weapon, consider it to be a slow-moving ICBM, because they will do everything in their power to plant that in an American city. I'm convinced of it. Call me crazy, but you know these people and you know what they're able of doing. Yes, sir, there's a gentleman in the back. The question was, why the difference between the effectiveness of air power, it's really what you're talking about, in Serbia as opposed to Iraq? What time is it now? It's 15 minutes to 7. You'll be out of here by about 9 o'clock tonight if I really do this one justice. Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, desert wars are almost always decisive, particularly to the side with air power. It's not a matter of incremental wins in desert warfare. Victory is almost always overwhelming. The case of the Italians against the Brits in 1940, the Brits turn around and fight Rommel in 1941, and they get their rear end handed to them on a plate. You look at the 1967 war, Israel against Syria and Egypt. Look at the 72 war. I could go on and on. Look at the 91 war against the Iraqis in Desert Storm. These wars tend to be decisive simply because of the nature of the terrain, the fact that it's flat, open, and once you break an enemy force, he has nowhere to run. Whereas in a place like Serbia, which is mountainous, heavily forested, cut by rivers and streams, bridges, it's extremely difficult to achieve that degree of decision. Second is the nature of the enemy. Remember, the object of warfare is not to kill the enemy. The object of warfare is to break the enemy's will to resist. Clausewitz said, war is a test of will against two sides, two contending sides, both of whom fully expect to win. And therefore, you have to measure will. And the will of the Serbs to resist was orders of magnitude, several times greater, to my mind, than was the will of the Iraqis to resist, given the difference in the nature of their regimes. The third is that even though only 4 years separates the Serbian campaign from the campaign you just saw, there is a sea change in the way the American military applies force in 2003 than the way they did in 1999, for two reasons. Number one is, I'm a soldier, bear with me here. Number one was you had the synergy of ground and air power on the ground, as opposed to the war in Serbia, which was only a single dimension. Secondly, you had the ability, this is the first, I would argue, war that emphasized the interdependence of the air and the land battle. For the last 50 years, we've been talking about air and land battle, air-land battle, et cetera. To my mind, this is the first time where air power became an indispensable element to winning the ground war. Never happened before. It's always been something added, something extra, something that's not necessary. But in this case, the synergy that you get from being able to see an enemy and to destroy him with overwhelming killing power, and to control his territory and to control his land is so overwhelming at this stage that the difference in the ability to apply that type of killing power is orders of magnitude greater in this war than it was in 1999. And I've got 12 other reasons that I could give you, but I'll go to the next question. I hope that answers your question. The question was, why the misfire in 1991 with the Shiite Rebellion, principally around Basra and the Marsh Arabs? And the answer, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's the old thing about, well, why didn't we win the war? Well, hindsight's always 20/20. It seems to me that in March of 1991, there was not an American newsman, military man, politician, and very few citizens in our country who thought that Saddam Hussein would last a week. I thought, most of you in this room thought that it was over. Remember I told you earlier that one of our biggest failings is to measure tenacity, resolve, and will, as opposed to counting tanks? And we equated the destruction of the Republican Guard, which was Saddam's bodyguard, if you will, or only really useful military formation, as tacit proof that the regime in Baghdad was doomed, and that eventually the regime would collapse, and the surest way to collapse the regime would be to encourage revolts in the south, in Basra, among the Shiites, and in the north, in the Turkish border with the Kurds. And oh, by the way, that collection of humanity makes up about 71 or 72% of the population of that country. QED. He has no army. He has no tanks. 72% are in revolt. The man is doomed. Well, we sometimes fail in our estimations to really determine what the resolve of the ruling elite is. And it's been a great lesson. By the way, I think we applied that lesson to Milosevic a few years later, when we no longer assumed that the destruction of the army or the separation of the leader and the ruling elite from the army was enough to guarantee the guy's demise. We've gotten wiser about it. But yeah, I think it was a miscalculation. It was a gross miscalculation, some would say, and certainly a tragic one. And oh, by the way, I think to some extent we're paying a price for that today because of the Shiites, let's say mistrust, but certainly trepidation about having Americans back in their midst, particularly when there's no evidence that Saddam is dead. The question was, assuming we'll be in a military campaign in the next 5 to 10 years, how will the character of that warfare change? By the way, the reason I took this job at Sylvan in 2000 is I was absolutely convinced that we would not be involved in any more major military campaigns at all. I mean, it was time to get out, take the uniform off, because the days of American wars are over. Boy, was I wrong. I think the principal failure that we have today in our military machine is speed. What the 3rd Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force did was magnificent, but it was dicey for two reasons. Number one, is that we can never build a military force that maneuvers at the operational level by ground that can exceed a certain velocity. A tank can go 60 miles an hour, but the velocity of a tank at a river crossing in front of a blown bridge is 0. And we must, over the next 4 or 5 years, perfect our ability to achieve maneuver speed in the air. And I think if there's going to be one big jump in what you see between now and, say, 2010 or whenever, is going to be a shifting of the maneuver forces, the Army and the Marines, from this ground-based maneuver, which you saw a few weeks ago, and increasingly into maneuvering by air, because we realize that we don't want to do that long 300-mile line of communication again. It was just too hard. Not too hard. It could have been bad. And the way to do that is we must develop the ability to deliver forces by air, which it's an interesting thing for any of you who are affiliated with that unnamed service that wears blue uniforms and makes too much money. Not only is the Air Force now responsible for providing the firepower quotient for this war and the intelligence and observation quotient for this war, but in the next war, I think the Air Force will be responsible for also providing the transportation and providing the speed. And this demands a military of a new sort, where service biases and service prejudices will drift away and will go to war as a single team. We got very close to it this time. But you wait. One of the things that I found interesting, I remember sitting in 1992 when I was writing my book on the Gulf War, sitting in the back of the room, and there was this huge food fight between the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. And they're shouting and screaming. The issue had to do with the fire support coordination line, or the separating line between the Air Force and the ground forces for firepower. Shouting and screaming at each other and using expletives that I will not repeat in mixed company. And I turned to my buddy, who was sitting next to me, and I said, George, okay, let me get this straight. We won this war, didn't we? But it's not whether you win or lose the war. It's the great food fight that occurs after the war is over that I find more interesting. But I think we're in a new era. I think we're going to have to find a way to accelerate the pace of maneuver in order of magnitude in order to reduce the risk of doing what I just mentioned to you. Yes, sir, in the back of the room. The question was about the constabulary function of the military. And this is very, very dangerous ground. Because as you're seeing now, more soldiers will be involved in Iraq doing what you've just mentioned, the constabulary function, will ever engage in close combat. Increasingly, we're seeing this constabulary function being sort of the heavy lifting, particularly that services like the Army are engaged in right now. Be very, very, very careful. Well-trained, well-motivated, close combat soldiers can do the constabulary mission very well. Where are the headlines screaming about how the American military has screwed it up in Kosovo, in Serbia, in Albania, in Haiti? I mean, where are the screaming headlines? They're not there. The problem that you run is, to your point exactly, when we build constabulary armies, as we did in Japan in the late 1940s, the opposite's not true. That militaries that are built to be constabularies, that are essentially military police organizations, when they're faced with a formidable enemy, as the 24th and the 25th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Division were in June 1950, wind up getting butchered. So be very, very careful when we talk about two different militaries, one for peacekeeping and one for warfighting. I think we just don't have the manpower to do that. And when it gets hard, ultimately, we have to put soldiers in harm's way who are not prepared for the experience. What do I attribute the lack of resistance among the Iraqis? Two things. Number one was, as I mentioned to you earlier, was a decision made by the high command of the Iraqi army to change the way they would actively resist the Americans, to follow the Somalian technical example of using the Fedayeen, the Special Republican Guard, and the Special Security Organization as essentially a paramilitary guerrilla irregular force in attempting to kill Americans. Secondly was the inability of the Republican Guard to connect themselves with Baghdad because of the cutting of the communications by special forces, and their inability to maneuver under the Air Force umbrella of precision weapons. They found themselves, as I mentioned to you earlier, with two unacceptable alternatives. If they tried to mass, as they did on 3 different occasions in this war, they were annihilated If they simply stayed in place, they had no choice but to break and run, because they would have been systematically taken apart as the Marines and as the Army forces closed in on Baghdad. And finally, I will say this. How do I put this? The Iraqi Army has gone through 3 cycles of reform since about 1973. Between 1986, at the Battle of Al-Fa against the Iranians, and 1989, the Iraqi Army, frankly, I know you may not believe this, but was very, very good. They really decimated the Iranian army, which was about 3 times their size in 1986 to 87. But what happened to the Iraqi army is the same thing that happened to the Russian army in the late 30s, when you have an absolute dictator who then becomes jealous of a successful army and then decapitates the leadership. And what Saddam has done routinely and consistently since 1988 is decapitate, oftentimes execute and imprison those military officers who were successful simply because they became popular. And so you wind up with this automatic instrument of generating incompetence, or at least a lack of skill. And that's one of the, by the way, if you want to read a great book, there's a book by a gentleman named David Victor Hansen. He may have read some of the stuff. He was on TV with me about a month ago. The book is called The Western Way of War. And he talks about why Western armies fight differently than other armies. And he uses the Greeks he's a classical scholar, and he uses the Greeks as an example of explaining why that is. And I won't go into it now because I don't have time. But if you really want to read a terrific book and understand a little bit more about the cultural underpinnings of the difference in the quality of these armies, I'd recommend that you read that book. The question was, do you see the military setting the foreign policy, I think is what your point, the foreign policy of the United States? God, I hope not. I hope not. And it's a great question to end this talk on, because I think it's propitious and it's very important and timely. You know, the first time I ever voted was last November. I come from a generation of military officers, most of whom are in command, senior command in Iraq today, who work very hard and are very proud of being apolitical. It's a tradition going back to Sherman in the 1870s, during the period of Reconstruction, when the military, for the last time, was politicized because of Reconstruction, and vowed, as a matter of conscience, that they would become and remain apolitical. We're the only democracy in the world that has never been controlled by a military organization. That includes Great Britain, by the way. You know, it's called the British Army, not the Royal Army, because remember, the Army overthrew James I, I guess. Charles I, right. So my father never voted. Both my children were officers in the military, and neither one of them ever voted until they left the service. I remember my father used to come home on election day, and I got so sick of this. My brother and I, he'd set us at the table, and he'd sit down and explain to me one more time why he took great pride in the fact that he never cast a ballot. Now, once he retired, God, he'd drive 40 miles through snow to vote for dog catcher. It was terrible. But that's the ethos of the American military establishment. It's the Anglo-American military tradition, Anglo-Saxon military tradition, that works very hard, just as we separate church and state, to separate the military establishment in the state. And I think we learned in Vietnam the danger of 2 things: over-militarizing foreign policy, which I think we would say, all agree, that occurred in the 60s. And secondly, going to war without the tacit backing of the American people. And those of us who are veterans of Vietnam are all scarred by both of those experiences. Now, will the new generation change that? Will hubris become an issue with the American fighting man? I hope not, but it's something that all of you as voters need to look out for. Listen, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. It's been fun.